Greetings, my name is JC,
And I'm Ian.
and this is the Gamer's Gaiden podcast episode 51. In this episode, we're going to be talking about remakes and remasters.
Yeah, we thought it was kind of important to maybe touch on this because the whole remake and remaster thing is a really big part of the gaming environment right now.
Yeah, and it's something that's always been there, but especially in the recent generation, couple generations, it's really picked up steam, and we figured it was an interesting topic to discuss. But before we get into the full discussion proper, we do have two disclaimers just to kind of clarify sort of what we're sort of ignoring or not talking about by choice. We figured that first off, we're not talking about the game of the year editions. And the reason why is because generally they're just the same retail version, maybe with a couple of hot fixes or patches and stuff like that, and all the DLC. So they're not really part of this discussion whenever we're talking about remakes and remasters, even though it is like a re-release, and sometimes some of the updates do sort of like update some of the resolutions and stuff like that. And the second one is we figured that we should touch light on reboots and within this discussion. And the reason why is because although like you can have hybrids with everything, it can be a remake and a reboot at the same time. We consider games that are a retelling of the story in game a remake. However, reboot is more so whenever a game that basically restarts a series more or less from scratch. And
Yeah.
a great example of this is Square Enix's newer Tomb Raider series, where that new trilogy of games came out, and it really rebooted the franchise. And a lot of its aspects were kind of like borrowed from the original series, where it's like, okay, you could argue it's semi a remake, but it's more of a reboot than anything else. So we're not really considering games like that. A couple of other examples are sort of Metroid Prime in its way that it rebooted the gameplay, although it does fit in between the older games, and it is still chronologically in there because Nintendo likes to do that. It's not really a remake, it's sort of like a reboot of its gameplay, so to speak. So we're not always just talking about story elements and stuff like that. It can be like gameplay and stuff like that too.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And I mean the Bethesda Doom Wolfenstein games. I mean, Wolfenstein technically Return to Castle Wolfenstein was the reboot of the series,
Hmm.
but
Yeah, and it was kind of like a
it's
hybrid in between the two of them, according to the press, sort of from what we could
yeah,
find. But
a little bit of a reboot and a remaster, but
mhm.
it really the current timeline of the Wolfenstein series picks up from there. I mean, you also have the Wolfenstein, the Ravensoft Wolfenstein that came out in 2008.
Mhm.
That's drastically different from everything, and it's its own standalone piece. So that's there's a reboot as well. So
Yeah, yeah,
there's a lot out there. They're very different from a remake or a remaster.
yeah.
So we wanted to kind of touch on that. So that's why some of these things you might wonder, hey, why didn't they mention Game X? Well, uh,
That's
a
mainly
lot of
why.
times it's probably because we considered it a reboot to the franchise.
Hmm. Hmm. And honestly, that's kind of a different discussion on its own, which
Yeah,
could also be discussed here. But we figured, like, maybe in a future episode, we'll see.
yeah, for sure. So let's kind of get into the difference between the two,
Hmm.
because there is, in my opinion, there's a pretty big difference between a remake and a remaster.
Yeah, me too.
A remake a lot of times is, in my opinion, it's a fresh update on the original IP,
Hmm.
while maintaining the integrity of the original story.
Yeah,
So something like the Final Fantasy VII remake, where yes, it does include some different elements, and they have changed some parts of it. It at its core, it's Final Fantasy VII.
yeah,
They've taken all the characters, all the settings, a lot of the main plot beats, and updated it visually.
yeah. They're
Made changes that they need to take essentially like a 5-hour section of the original game and make it into a 40-hour
Yeah,
experience.
like they
I,
took aspects from later in like disc one and from disc two and stuff like that, and sort of inserted
yeah,
those plot points into the remake. But like, Yeah, that's definitely a good example of kind of like what we're talking about whenever we're talking about
Or
remake.
even the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah, those are
taking
other
the
great examples.
yeah, and those two things are partially why we're having this
Hmm.
conversation is because those are two of the biggest games available at the moment,
Yeah.
and they're both remade versions of an older game.
Hmm.
I
Yeah,
mean, that
and
right
it's
there is telling that the current market is very much remade or remastered.
yeah, and especially like the Resident Evil games. Just to finish up on that point, like they're more of remakes than remasters because like although you still go to the same levels areas, the levels themselves are different or rebuilt up from scratch and stuff like that. Like you still go to the police quarters and you still go to like Sector 6, right? Like it's still something that's still there. Like Seventh Heaven is still like there, but it's redone. Maybe it has some extra rooms or something like that and whatnot. Um,
Or in the an RE2, the
mhm.
Mr. X being a primary part of the your first playthrough, whereas he was not in the
Yeah, as
original.
much in the original, yeah. And remasters, that's kind of like where they keep the almost exact same gameplay elements and story elements, like almost verbatim. Like let's just say like 2/3 or 4/5 or something like that to just give it a rough brush strokes. But that's kind of what we're talking about whenever we're talking about remasters. So like generally, if a game has like HD at the end of it, that's a good hint that it's probably a remaster for us anyway.
Yeah.
Or if it has remastered, like a Spyro or Crash games are good examples of this because like all the levels, although like they might have changed slightly, they're you still collecting the same number of gems. The levels are still more or less the same. Like everything is more or less there. It's just kind of like in some cases reskinned or reprogrammed or just texture upgraded and stuff like that. And that's kind of what we're talking about with remasters.
Yeah, I think a great example of a remaster is the Final Fantasy VIII remaster that came out last year.
Yeah.
Because really, all they did was clean up the sprites
Hmm.
to make them look more current.
Yeah, and if I recall correctly, like the models had more polygons to them because they updated them a little bit. And that's like it, it's just making the game a little bit better, but nothing really changed, right? The exact same thing
No,
happened with
absolutely.
the Resident Evil
They didn't fix the draw
remaster.
system, so
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Um, so yeah, that's what we're kind of talking about with remakes and remasters. And we kind of alluded to something else, which are ports. So let's talk about that next because this is kind of tricky and we went back and forth quite a bit on like, well, how do we define ports? Because like some of them are kind of remasters because of there's upgrades and stuff like that, and like are they not? Are they? Like it's a tough call, and that's the thing about like a lot of things in life and in video games. Like there's a lot of overlap. So with knowing that, ports
and a lot of it's subjective too, right?
exactly,
That's
yeah.
ultimately that's what we came down to. It was
Hmm.
we had a huge discussion on whether the Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag on Xbox 360 and on PS4 is the PS4 version a remastered version.
Yeah, because
Well,
it's like, well, the models potentially have more of a polygon count because the PS4 can like handle all that, and like the weathering effects are better, the water looks better, like all these things, right? And like maybe that's something they just would have done like 10 years later if they would have just done a remaster, right? But it happened
yeah.
a couple of years or a year or right away, like any of those examples whenever the like original game came out on like the 360 and PS3. So yeah,
So
and
we kind of came to a bit of an agreement in that we've got stuff like the Telltale games,
mhm.
particularly The Walking Dead, because that was their sort of original. Um, it wasn't their first, but that was their like
That was their
big.
claim to fame that brought them on the map for a lot of people. And it was ported to everything from the PC to the consoles to newer consoles to cell phones, and the
You can
graphic
probably play it on your
fidelity.
smart fridge.
Yeah, probably. And if you can't, talk to
Get on it.
LG. I would probably never play that game on a smartphone or anyway. But anyway, yeah, and like some of them might have some upgraded lighting effects like that. But for all intents and purposes, the reasons why is because the hardware can't handle it, right? Like, it's kind of like playing a game on medium settings versus high settings, and like that feature was still there, but it was turned off for, let's say, the PlayStation 3, and it's there for the PlayStation 4 because it actually has that texturing effects for I don't know, the sweat effects and stuff like that. And that's kind of what we're talking about for ports. It's got to be more than just like a couple of flips of a switch, or like cutting some lighting effects because it doesn't work on a cell phone, for example, because it is just the same game. The only reason why it wasn't put there from the original PC version was because it just couldn't handle it on the console or the device. And a couple other examples of ports are the PlayStation 1 classics that were available on the PlayStation 3. Like, you can buy a lot of old PlayStation 1 games, such as Legend of Dragoon, on the PlayStation 3. And sure, it has a filter like over it from the emulator, so that it looks good on your resolution and stuff like that. But like, for like, we're considering that just a port. It is like remastered a little bit, but we're fitting that into the port category.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's go on to some topics about the remakes and remasters and our thoughts of them now that we've kind of gotten all that stuff out of the way and sort of defined everything. But let's go into our thoughts on the remakes and remasters personally, and specifically, like, when and why we like them. Ian?
I mean, it's all subjective, and it's a difficult conversation, as we know from having it over the last couple of days,
Yeah.
that sometimes it makes absolute sense for something to be like remade and remastered to make it
Mm-hmm.
more current and bring it into like back into the zeitgeist, I guess.
Right.
And it really does push the question, I find, of like, is all, like, we argue a lot about video games being art, but is
Yeah.
all of it actually art? Does
Yeah.
all of it need to be updated? We
Mm-hmm.
have there's three different versions of Shadow of the Colossus, and
Right.
I would argue that each one of those is important and necessary. Would we need 3 issues of, I don't know, Call of Duty Black Ops? I would argue no. Now,
Right.
I do
There's a little bit of
agree.
biasness in there, but I mean,
There is, but I mean, we did get an updated version of the Modern Warfare campaign, the
yeah.
Call of Duty 4, and I think that's completely necessary, because I think that was a game that really changed the multiplayer environment,
Mm-hmm.
and it did so many things for the first person shooter genre, period.
Yeah,
So
and
it's an important piece of gaming history that you're making relevant again.
yeah, and I think that brings up an interesting point of, personally, I think how some of these companies look at whether or not they're going to do an HD remaster or remake the game it is based off of sales. Like, we're probably not going to see a remake of Brave Fencer Musashi, a great SquareSoft game back from the late 90s that a lot of people like and has a cult following, because it doesn't have the following of Final Fantasy VII or some other games that have, those massive sale numbers, because as great of a game as it is to some people, it's not necessarily something that will get a remaster or anything like that. And
Exactly.
yeah, and personally myself, I think when these should be made is at least on a personal level, because of the history of games, which you sort of touched on, because this is one of the ways to be able to archive some of these older games and have them available for newer generations. Because sure, some cases games still look fine, like Super Mario World still looks okay because that's kind of like a style of art. But the thing is that sometimes it was just due to technical limitations. So, like,
Yeah.
for example, in my opinion, like Metal Gear Solid is kind of one of those examples. It came out in the era of early polygon 3D games, and it's like that exact same game could probably be like remastered or something like that for a newer
We
generation.
we did get a remaster of that.
True. On
We
the
got
GameCube,
the twin
right?
twin snakes on the GameCube, which
Yeah.
did look a lot better
Yeah.
and was still the same game.
And it makes it accessible for younger generations who don't necessarily have access to the hardware, because a lot of the cases, like, they're not like you or I, where they keep all the consoles that they had and every single video game that they've bought, and they have a collection of like a couple thousand games. They sell, like, I used to work at EB Games, tons of people sell their old consoles in games in order to get the new ones, so they
Yep.
lose access to like their older brother's PlayStation, and the PlayStation 2 is out, and then that's the console that they have, right? Like, not everybody has all three consoles. A lot of us as gamers do, and I would imagine a lot of our audience does as well, but like, out there, the reality is that that's not necessarily true. And
No.
my cousin is one of those people. He doesn't have like the funds to be able to have like a PS3, a PS4, and a PS5, right? He has a PS4 and that's it. And it's like there's some PS3 games that he used to play that he loves that maybe he wants to replay. So if they remake it or remaster it for the PS5 or 6 in the future, that'll give him access to being able to play it. And I think that's important for those types of people. And that's when and why
It's
I personally like whenever
it's
they're
true,
out.
and even beyond that, for people like myself and yourself who do have, like, we tend to keep our old consoles.
Mm-hmm.
It's to some degree it's a convenience.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Especially, yeah.
for
Like,
me to play an older game, I'm gonna have to, like, a lot of times have something to convert the old, like, whatever way I was supposed to be plugging it into my TV to an HDMI
I'm really
input.
glad you
And
brought that up, because like I have a bunch of upscalers. I have the FrameMeister and I have the SSSC, OSSC, sorry, and which
those are
are
extremely expensive.
exactly, and that's not a practical solution for everybody.
No.
And like, if you use a $20 solution, it'll work for some games, but I'm sorry, if you play Contra on one of the really cheap upscale solutions, there is so much input lag. You may as well just be playing an emulator. Like, there's no point to it, and it's still a
Yeah.
cost, right? So it's like, okay, well, I can just repurchase the game for $5. Yeah.
It's still a cost, and it adds a layer of challenge to it. So having the ability to even beyond that, even removing those like the technical issues,
Mm-hmm.
it's a lot of times, especially as adults now, and the way people's living rooms are set up. A lot of people have TVs that are now wall mounted,
Yep.
whereas back when we were kids, I mean, I had a giant TV that sat on the floor
Yeah. Yeah.
because it was in a massive cabinet. Yes, I'm old, I know, but you could just hook your console up to it and sit it on the floor next to it, or
Mm-hmm.
on top of it. You didn't have to worry about, oh man, how am I going to run these wires up to there, and even if I get the wires there, where can I put my console?
Sure.
Is it going
Yeah.
to have to dangle? Like,
Yeah.
that's not practical.
And
There's so many ways. Yeah, even we ran into the situation a few days ago because my wife wanted to replay the original Final Fantasy after finishing the remake,
mm-hmm.
and the steps that we would have to go to. I was like, you know what? Look, I'll just spend the $20 and
The PS4
get
version.
get the PS4 version,
Yeah.
because it's easier than all of the other steps that would have to be taken
Exactly. Yeah.
for her to play it even remotely comfortable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of good reasons to do it,
Yeah.
but
I'm.
there's a lot of times where I personally find it's almost a little bit too much.
Yeah.
I don't know. What do you kind of think about that, JC?
I think it's the time frame and the game. So,
Yeah.
like, if it's maybe within a couple of years and they're just like, oh, we're gonna remake, I don't know, Siphon Filter HD, and the game came out 2 years ago or something like that, or we're gonna remake The Last of Us and it's gonna be HD and it's only a year later, it's like, that's awesome, but unless I'm a super fan, I don't care. Like, I can play it on my old console, or what have you, like especially if it's still out, like if it's still available for the, well, let's go from PS3 to PS4. If it's still available for the PS3 and it's still sold in stores and the console's still sold in stores, that's when it's too much for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, another conversation that you and I had, the Ezio collection.
Hmm.
I mean, I think that those 3 games are, a very important part of the, like, Assassin's Creed storyline and history for that matter. They
Yeah.
were some of the best in the series. Did we need a collected version of them released now? I don't think so. I just I don't I
Right.
don't think it was necessary. You can go to almost any store and find a copy of all 3 of those Assassin's Creed games, probably for less than $10.
Yeah. And
So,
I think it kind of happens a little bit because, um, if you think about it, in console gaming, this is kind of, I think, what's sort of influenced it. And reverse compatibility isn't always necessarily a guaranteed thing. And it looks like the coming generation, they're hopefully going to sort of like accept like further backward compatibility with both the PlayStation and the Microsoft consoles. But the thing is that like because it's not a thing and consoles do have a turnover rate that is faster than PCs, technically, which I'll get to in a second, these types of things happen because you can't just take, it's not like Windows where you can just take your game that worked in Windows 8 and then get a patch that'll help it work in Windows 10, right? You can't just take your disc from your PS3 and take GTA 4 and then put GTA 4 into your PS4 and then have it work with a patch update. That's not something that's in the sort of ideology of how console companies work, and because of that they just re-release the whole entire game and get you to pay the full price. And that's another example of kind of like when I think it's too much and why I think it's too much, because it's like because of the way that the ecology of consoles work, this has sort of happened, and it's sort of unfortunate because, as we mentioned just previously, not everybody keeps their consoles, right? And if you
mhm.
could do that, it would be great because then you would be able to you would be able to maybe keep your favorite games and still have your copy of Final Fantasy VII and put it in your PlayStation, even though you sold like 90% of your PS1 games and your console, right? And that has been a thing with some of them. Like obviously, I'm aware that PS1 games worked in the PS2, and that's one of the reasons why I got rid of my original PlayStation and sold it to one of my best friends at the time, and then
Same.
rebought it from him a few years later whenever he was bored of it. But yeah, like I'm well aware of that. But yeah, that's kind of what we think of that and why it's sort of too much.
And I mean, ultimately, it just to me, it feels kinda lazy.
Hmm.
You know, I understand, again, it's something that we talked about where, um, things that are well-told stories.
Yeah.
It 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 is almost important that we bring those back and keep those current
Hmm.
because it is art. You know,
Yeah.
it's masterfully told stories. I guess for a lot of people who've been playing games for a long time, it's something that they would have played, but you still have, like, each year you're getting more and more people getting into uh the media,
Right.
and um it's important that they have the opportunity to enjoy those stories.
Hmm.
And you don't want something like visuals or I guess older style controls to get in the way of them being able to enjoy that and experience that story.
Yeah, because that's a
So it
very good reality to bring up because some people don't like 16-bit artwork and some people don't like tank controls, and
exactly.
there might have been a legitimate reason for those to be in there, or just like it gives it a different aesthetic, but people who would enjoy the game don't necessarily care or like those aspects of sort of like the original wizardry game is a very like relentless dungeon crawl, and maybe a newer style of wizardry game would work. So there's been sort of like, I guess, spiritual successors, which is a different discussion. But like in the remasters of them, a lot of people do not like the graphics of Final Fantasy VII. They don't like the light bulb arms. That like some people think it's charming, and some people just think it's absolutely stupid. And it's like, yeah, okay, it doesn't look as great as Final Fantasy VIII. I don't think anybody will disagree with you.
Yeah.
And that
But
prevents some people
even
from trying the game,
but
right?
even going back and playing Final Fantasy 8 now, it looks nothing like Final Fantasy 15.
Yeah, exactly.
And if 15 was your first exposure to the series, you could have a hard time going back
Yep.
and playing some of these older titles. And it's it's going to be a challenge, but you'll by not doing it, you're going to miss out on some of the best stories that have been told in games.
Exactly. And to have that sort of like loss in the ideas or even the gameplay aspects and stuff like that, because it's not always stories, right? Sometimes it's gameplay aspects where it's just
Yep.
like, sometimes it's gameplay aspects like Ghosts and Goblins, and like they've
Yeah.
remade that game so it's like 2.5D and stuff like that, and that appeals better to like newer generations and stuff like that, or just sort of like refreshes it even for the old fans and stuff like that. And
Exactly. And it gives people the opportunity to experience that.
mhm,
And it's wonderful that we have the option to do that.
yeah,
Now, I mean,
I completely agree.
in some cases, yeah, it feels incredibly lazy,
Yep. And it's
you
just
know,
a
and
cash grab.
very much it's almost like they just don't have to some degree. You sometimes feel like companies don't have the ideas to
Hmm.
put out something new.
Yeah, it's as if they're
So
just trying to output their 4 games a year, and they're like, well, 2 of them are going to have to be remakes because we just don't have the effort
we
or whatever it is to pump
and
out those games.
we don't want to take a risk. We don't want to take a risk on a new IP
Hmm.
and have the possibility of it failing.
And we're kind of
So
seeing this
here's
more as the.
Far Cry 3 HD because everybody loved Far Cry 3.
Mhm.
We'll clean it up, we'll put in work. Obviously, there's work that goes into it, but it's not anywhere near to the degree that you would have to put into a brand new IP.
Yeah, and this is something that's becoming more and more apparent as companies become larger and sort of more corporate and stuff like that, because that's kind of, they don't want to take that risk where they might go bankrupt by
No,
doing that. So yeah, and that's kind of
no,
like.
people are way too scared. I mean, I think we have a whole video on that.
Hmm. Yeah, we do.
Um, but it's it's part of the reality as to why we get a lot of remakes and remasters at this point. Now, I'm not saying I'm not excited. It's been wonderful getting remastered versions of older things that are just a lot harder to have access to.
Yeah, and I always like to see, especially whenever it's more of a remake instead of a remaster, just how they take like my favorite aspects of the game or aspects that I don't like in the game and evolve it into maybe something that I enjoy in a different way, right? And
Yeah.
it's always really cool to see that, because like the combat system doesn't work completely the same in Final Fantasy VII Remake that it did in 7, right? And
Oh,
I love the
absolutely.
combat system in 7. It was like
I also love the combat system at 7.
in like 7 Remake combat systems really really fun as well. Like
It is.
it in its own right, it's great, and it's great for different ways, and it's neat to see those types of things.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Now, so this is gonna sound kind of weird, but what do you kind of feel like would be an acceptable amount of time?
So for me, we both had a hard time answering this question. I'm gonna put 5 years. Like, and the reason why I say 5 is because I understand that people miss games, and going back to them, they aren't necessarily appealed to like, that was an old game. But if it was like an HD remaster or something like that, then like, okay, sure, like maybe 10 came out 5 years ago, but they just like did an HD remaster, and now I'm interested because I want to replay the game. It prevents people from like shying away from it, just because I like. Unfortunately, I've met quite a few people who think that way, who are just like, nah, the graphics suck. I'm not gonna do it. That was totally last generation's graphics. Forget about it. And
Yeah.
yeah, I mean,
See, I kind of think 5 years is a little too soon
yeah,
because I think that's you're looking at within a console generation
Hmm.
at that point, because like we discussed in our last Gaiden show,
Hmm.
it's like 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, that seems to be the average anyway.
That's kind of why I would lean toward a little bit towards maybe 10.
Yeah, or once a generation, or
Yeah,
console
you know,
generation, basically.
I I don't want to see an HD remaster of something that was released last gen.
Yeah, and I kind of agree with
In my
you.
opinion, it's too soon.
Yeah,
A lot of
unless
those
it's
things are available. A lot of those things are readily available. Now,
mhm.
I will say, yeah, they had a remastered version of Shadow of the Colossus and Ico released on the PS3,
Mhm.
and then they did release a Shadow of the Colossus remake on the PS4, but it was a remake.
Mhm.
You know, they very much went in and remade that. So, and I think that's okay. But again, I think that that game is a beautifully told story that everyone
Yeah,
should be
but
able to experience.
what you're kind of getting at, and this is one of the reasons why we kind of wanted to avoid reboots, or sorry, ports, which we discussed at the beginning, is because those are kind of a hybrid between a port to the newer console and a
Yeah.
little bit of a remaster. But it's kind of like it's more of a remaster than a port, so it's like, okay, well, it's soon enough for it to just be you see what we're getting at, like yeah. So
Yeah,
and
it's
I
no,
completely agree with you. Like, I think it made sense for those games to, because of how well they were received and everything, and preventing somebody who jumped over from the 360 to the PS4 and didn't have a PS3 the chance to play like those games like Shadow Colossus would have been bad. And I think that's in my like I think that was something that Sony considered whenever they thought, well, should we just, like, we just redid this. Somebody said that in
yeah,
the boardroom meeting. Somebody had to.
it's but on the opposite side of that, we have a BioShock collection which has an HD upgrade of BioShock 1 and 2,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think that's necessary.
Yeah.
Sure, I totally agree with porting the collection from the last generation to this generation.
And,
Sure,
and I agree
because
with you because
you're going to release collections of games on PC most of the time
yeah, and
because
that's
that's a
happened
very
since like
easy
the
transition.
80s. So like
Yeah.
this happened forever. And
So
I
to port that collection from PC to current gen consoles, sure.
mhm,
Do they need to all be like have
remastered.
like an HD filter ran through them? Not really.
Yeah, like
You
I
know, make it
recently
playable on
earlier.
my current hardware, but
Right. And so two things. And I recently played through I got bored of it, but through the BioShock 1 game on the PS4, and it was that collection that they gave out for free for the
yep.
PlayStation Plus whenever that a couple months ago. And if it was the original graphics, like, I don't think it really would have prevented me from wanting to try the game. Like, and I don't,
No.
I in this case, I like, it didn't really seem. I remember the way the game looked and the way it looks now, and yeah, it's better, but I don't think it's that much of a difference for, I think, people to care, because it still
No.
looked high quality at the time. So our opinion here might differ than other people, and that's fine. But that's kind of how I sort of like view that, and why I agree with you on that. And harkening back to what I was stating before, I think a reason why this type of stuff happens is because of the way that the dynamics work with consoles versus PCs. If it was on the PC, then it would have just been the latest patch, and it would just been a rebundle, and
Yeah.
that's not how consoles work. And so because of that, and you're kind of being forced to purchase another digital download or whatever, I think companies are sort of been forced to maybe make these like reskins to do some type of work, because as a consumer, I don't think a lot of people care to be like, okay, yeah, you did work to port it from PS3 to PS4, but I don't, like, that's not worth my money. Just give that to me. And
Yeah.
a reason why is because I get a free patch update on the PC. Like, the game that worked in Windows 8 and then Windows 10 came out, I didn't have to purchase the patch update to get it to work on Windows 10,
No, it's just
right?
it was just patched to work.
Exactly. And so because of that, in the console market, they do things like that where it's like, okay, and then it starts to get a little bit too much because it's like, well, like the Microsoft has been great at doing this. I can put in Panzer Dragoon Orta into the latest console and then download the huge download patch for it, and it will upscale it to 1080p or 720p. I don't remember the specifics about this one game, and then and then I can play the game with like the upscaled resolutions and everything that they've updated with the game like to this day. And
Yeah.
there's a handful of Xbox and 360 games that will play on the new console that you can do that for, and no one had to pay a dime for that. And
Nope.
thankfully, I think that's hopefully where the industry's sort of going, because
It
there's
it
been
seems to be.
rumors where the PlayStation may be doing the same thing, where you can put in like PS4 discs into the PS5, and like I'm going to be getting The Last of Us 2, and the last generation, like literally, like I played The Last of Us 2, the PS4 came out, and then an HD remake came out for the game, like within a year or something like that. And it's
It
like,
was within the first
really?
year of the system being
Like,
released.
it looked a lot better for the character models and stuff like that. Yes, I completely agree. The texturing, the polygon count, like everything looked better. I don't think, as much as I enjoyed it, I don't think it was super necessary. And if I can just take my PS4 Last of Us 2 game and then put it into my PlayStation 5 whenever I get that to be able to play it, and then maybe it has a quick patch to add in whatever cool new lighting effects the PS5 can handle and stuff like that the PS4 can't, and shaders and everything else that they want to tweak and stuff like that, that would be amazing, because it's just like I got the Skyrim HD pack for free on my computer. Like it worked from Windows 7 uh to Windows 10 for free. Like it didn't have to do anything. Like and
Whereas if you owned a console, you had to buy a new
mm-hmm.
version of Skyrim.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which I'm not saying it didn't look beautiful. It
Mm.
absolutely did.
Yeah, absolutely.
But was it another $70 worth?
Maybe
Probably
not.
not.
Yeah. And that kind of brings us to like, so like, is everything worth remaking? We've touched on this a couple times in the episodes, and I think the answer is no. Like,
No.
sometimes it doesn't need to be. Like, as much as I love Wind Waker, it's my favorite Zelda game. I don't think Wind Waker HD had to happen. The style of art didn't warrant it. You can find many YouTube videos on like, does it look better? Like, is this needed? And I agree. Like, did it? I don't know.
Well, and especially since all of the Nintendo consoles up to that point were backwards compatible. The Wii
Yeah, exactly.
was backwards compatible to the GameCube, as was the Wii U.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where that was released. Now, if they did put out Wind Waker HD on the Switch, sure.
Right.
I can at least understand that because it's a different format
And it's been like
and
10 years since the original has come out.
it's not playable. It's like how there's been versions of Ocarina of Time on many different systems.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's a different format.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I have it on my GameCube. I have it on my 3DS.
Yeah. And
I can't just move that piece of data to a
right.
different console. Like they have to be on a different formatted
Yeah, especially from going from the 64
piece of hardware.
cartridge, it doesn't fit into the disk
Yeah.
drive of your
No, definitely not.
GameCube. It's just not something that works.
And it's almost the same size as your 3DS. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
yeah, it's
And I think that's kind
in
of one of the
situations like that. I sort of understand. I do understand porting something over to different consoles, but again, that's more porting. Does it need to be
remade
like
or remastered?
remastered?
I don't know.
No.
Yeah. And I think a better method moving forward is what I had just talked about with like, since everything is kind of sort of standardized, it's on a Blu-ray disc or it's a download right now, and it doesn't matter what console you are, it's not going to be HD DVD or Blu-ray or DVD or whatever mini disc, so it's kind of universal, and if they model the way that Windows has been working and PC gaming has been working, then you can get these kind of updates and stuff like that, and that ideology moving forward, I think, would really help the industry, because then
Absolutely.
you keep everything accessible. You especially with everything going digital, right? Like there's no reason for the PlayStation 1 classics to not really fully be available on the PlayStation 4. Like I don't understand that. Like it should just be available. Like
Yeah.
it move this forward, and then you don't necessarily it could you still want to buy it. It's $5 or $10 for the game, right? And I kind of see, maybe this is wishful thinking, but I kind of see the industry sort of moving forward in this way. And if it does, I'll be more happier, because like I won't have to buy a 15th copy of Final Fantasy VII, even though I
Yeah.
probably would.
You can just put it in the new console and play it.
Exactly. Yeah.
As long as the hardware type is the same,
Mm-hmm.
if it's a disc going in a disc drive,
Yeah.
there should be no reason why it can't read it,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
other than the manufacturer putting limitations on it.
Exactly.
And I
Yeah. And we're kind of almost at that
appreciate
point.
the effort,
So
but it's not a tremendous amount of effort.
yeah. And since we're almost there at this point anyway, why not just take the leap, right?
Yeah.
So let's go on to some games where we think remakes were done right, and just kind of go through some examples of where we think some game examples that this was probably the most successful type of examples, and the types of examples we like to see. We've already mentioned one of them, Ian.
Actually, we've already mentioned a lot of them, but
We have.
I think one of the better ones was the RE2 remake.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yep.
It it updated it to play how current players would be playing,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of like the story beats are the same. If you remember a lot of the puzzles from the previous games, they are executed in the same way, just
Yeah.
maybe
Some of them
displayed
were
a
updated a little
little.
bit, but
Yeah, like because you have new visual options,
mm-hmm.
so you can make changes that way, and I found that really interesting. But they still kept the heart of it.
Yep.
You know, they didn't remove its core. You
Mm-hmm.
know, they kept it intact, and it played how I remembered playing it when I was a kid.
It still felt like the same game. That's the big
Yeah,
thing, right?
it really did.
Yeah. And Crash Bandicoot series, the Insane Trilogy that was recently released, as well as the Spyro series that was recently released, is a great example of kind of like a like an HD remaster done right, because it's not just a
Yeah,
filter, it's not just kind of like recompiling the backgrounds or like making the resolutions higher and stuff like that. It was literally like remaking the same game. It was like 95% the same,
well,
and
they had lost most of the code for Crash.
yeah, I don't remember, but
It was a lot of work that went into crafting that to be the same, and it's you can feel the love. You can
hmm
actually feel the love that's put into those.
yeah,
You know, there's a level of care that's taken
hmm
with the source material, and you can feel that.
yeah. And the Final Fantasy 2 and 3, the DS versions, these were originally 2D games on the Nintendo, which people just in North America unfortunately didn't have access to for the longest time until like the PlayStation era. And then, they re released it on, or released 2 on the Game Boy Advanced, but the DS versions, like remade the games basically to be 3D.
Yep.
And those games, like Dragon Quest is another series where this happened as well. 3, 4, and 5 were remade. Those are 2D games for the Nintendo and Super Nintendo. And those are games that are like rebuilt from the ground up, but it's the same storyline. The same beats happen. I think even more so than the Resident Evil game. And I'll be honest, I haven't actually beaten the DS versions, but I played them, and yeah, those are examples of remakes done right.
Well, I think one of the biggest ones that we actually have not talked about once this episode
Hmm.
was was Link's Awakening.
Yeah,
You know, that was, I think that was such a risk
Yeah,
as a very obscure um Zelda title.
yeah, because it's a game that's well loved by like longtime fans of the series, not
Yeah.
necessarily newer fans, but like those hardcore fans, I'll say. Because this game not only updated the actual like complete game engine to be like 2.5D, it upgraded the inventory system to be more modern, it upgraded the combat system somewhat to be more modern because you didn't just have an A or B that switched. It
Yep.
kept the exact same dungeons, it kept the exact same bosses with like more or less the same patterns. Like everything in the game is the same. It's just like as if it was created by like a company today. Um,
It was
and
beautifully done.
hmm
Just beautiful. It was a an absolute joy to play.
yeah, yeah,
You know,
and
and it's if you didn't have a Game Boy like what 25 years ago, you probably didn't play this.
yeah, and let's be honest, most people who did were just playing Pokemon at that time anyway. So
Yeah, exactly. No,
yeah,
no, you're 100% correct. You were playing Pokemon.
because a lot of people miss this game that probably shouldn't have, and that was a great example of a remake done right because it not only did it correctly, it brought a game that a lot of people would have missed and did miss back to the forefront so people could enjoy it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then obviously one of Ian's favorite games that he likes to bring up, that JC has
Shadow
got
of
to
the
play,
Colossus.
Shadow of the
Shadow of the
Colossus.
Colossus. Yeah, it's I think it should be remade every generation. There's just so much heart in this story, and it's just so beautifully done. We don't get stories like this every day.
Yeah.
So
So on the
keep just keep bringing it.
so on the inverse of that, let's go through some examples where we think that they're pretty lackluster and not a great idea.
Some of
Um,
these are controversial. What's yours, JC?
Resident Evil 6. So it was released on the PS3, and then it was almost like a, what was it? It was originally a PS3 360 game, and then re-released a couple of years later on the Xbox One and the PS4. I don't understand why. You at the time you could still purchase a PS3 and you could still purchase Resident Evil 6 brand new.
Yeah.
I don't understand why this was released, and like it looks a little bit better, but like what they did was not anything worth the extra purchase price if you had already purchased the game. Like really the only reason in my opinion why they did this was to basically be like, well, you haven't played it yet and you bought the new console, so if you got some money and some time, go ahead and play it.
I mean, pretty much. You did get at this point, all the Resident Evil games are available on current gen
Yeah.
in a disc format.
Hmm.
So I mean, I can understand a completionist wanting to have that,
Yeah.
but this was released well before any of the other games were
Hmm.
like upscaled and ported over.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm with you. I don't agree that this was necessarily necessary.
Hmm. And your example, Ian?
I'm gonna say let's go Pikachu and let's go Eevee.
Just for the record, I disagree with this, but I understand your comments on it.
It it took Pokemon Yellow, which was, I mean, wonderful because it was just red and green. Well, not just red and green, but very similar, or red and blue in North America.
Yeah,
It's
it was a
very
mix between the two of them with Pikachu added.
Yeah, and you had the Pokemon wandering around outside the ball, which
Yeah.
lots of fun. And I mean, yes, they did a lot of things right. I love the visual upgrades, but in my opinion, they really they gutted the heart of the series.
I
They took
agree.
out they took out the combat. You
Yeah.
know, I mean, yes, yeah, the trainer battles are in there, but there's no battling wild Pokemon, and that's to me that's a big part of Pokemon is grinding.
Hmm.
You need to be grinding to get your Pokemon
Yeah.
leveling up and evolving,
They
and
really catered to the Pokemon Go fans, which is kind of what
they
you're
did.
getting at. And I had fun. I have Let's Go Eevee, and I had fun with the game. I didn't mind it, but like, yeah, every time I was playing the game, I was just kind of missing. I'm like, well, like, why can't I just like why isn't this just normal Pokemon? Like,
Well,
just give me
I
Sword and
don't
Shield.
I don't want to go capture, like I don't want to spend money on Pokeballs to go capture a bunch of Pokemon that I'm just gonna like set free. Or even worse, I'm not gonna set them free. I'm gonna grind them into candy. Like that's horrible.
Hmm.
That's worse than just beating them up and leaving them in the grass.
I guess.
Like at least it only fainted.
Hmm.
You gave him a concussion and you walked away. Yeah, I know, right? But it's still like
Yeah.
I played it for a while and then I got bored. I
Hmm.
got so incredibly bored and I'm like, I don't want to do this. I have
Yeah.
no interest in continuing. And then when Pokemon Sword and Shield came out, bam, I was in because it gave me exactly what I wanted from a Pokemon game.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, and I really feel like the ball was dropped hard on the Let's Go games.
Hmm. I was catering to the more casual market, right? And I'm a more casual Pokemon fan. I'm not. I haven't played every single Pokemon game that has come out, and I know not everybody has either. But
Yeah.
I'll play the ones that interest me, and that's why I'm kind of like, it's just a Pokemon-ish game. But yeah, it's definitely not Pokemon. I completely agree. Yeah.
But on that note, I guess looking forward,
Hmm.
what about something that you think should be remade or remastered?
Yeah, so we decided to each choose one game that we would like to see a game remade or remastered. This list was hard to do. We considered whether or not we think it would even be possible. I gave the Brave Fencer Musashi example. It's
It,
not gonna
it got a
happen.
sequel, JC. What else do you want?
Yeah, it did. Teenage me was very happy. Um, yeah. So Ian, what was your game that you chose?
Well, here's an interesting point. Mine was originally going to be the same one as yours because that was the first thing that popped into my head when we started having this conversation.
Yeah,
But I mean, you have a. I would just want it so I could play it because I
yeah.
actually haven't played it in its original format.
I was about to say the
Um,
same thing too, because I truly believe that you and other people. Maybe I'll do mine first then. I truly believe that like you and other people would be more prone to actually pick up and play the game, like just because it's so old. The game is Parasite Eve. Huge fan of the series, as subscribers will know if they've been watching for a while. And I don't want this game to be forgotten. Its legacy got thrown into a trash can and wasn't done justice with Third Birthday. And Parasite Eve 1 specifically and Parasite Eve 2 are great games in their own right. And with remakes on the rise, I think now is the time to do it, especially seeing Resident Evil 2 remake and Resident Evil 3 remake. I know they're both survival horror games. I am no way saying that this game needs to play like Resident Evil. In fact, I will hate the game if it does. Its uniqueness is what made me like it, because it was more of an RPG than Resident Evil was, and it was still a survival horror game, which was a genre that I loved and still do. And yeah, so Parasite Eve is my game of something that I think it needs to be remade. And I think there's enough fans out there or people who are interested
I'd buy a copy.
that would play the game to make it actually worth Square Enix's time. So hopefully, although they might just concentrate on remastering XX2 because that seems to be what they like to do. So, but that's my game, Parasite Eve. Back over to you, Ian.
I fully agree with you on that one. But when it came to me and I was like, okay, well, I got to think of something. I'm gonna say Omicron, the Nomad Soul.
Mm-hmm.
It came out on PC and the Dreamcast
Yeah.
a long time ago. It's one of Quantic Dream's first games. Yeah, I know a lot of people have feelings about Quantic Dreams.
But a
But
lot of people love Quantic Dreams, and this is sort of their origin, right?
it,
And
it is. It
I,
is. And a lot of people forgot about it and either don't know about it. A lot of people think that Fahrenheit or Indigo Prophecy might have been their first one, but no, this was wonderful. It's a very kind of cyberpunk ish
mm-hmm.
sort of game, but it still plays very similar to most of your Quantic Dream stuff. It's
Right.
a lot of the dialogue choices and interactions. But I I loved the story. I've actually played through it a couple of times. The soundtrack is amazing. It's David Bowie, and it actually has Bowie in it. It
Hmm.
has a performance by David Bowie in the game. So there
Yeah.
you go. That's my selling feature right there. A performance by David Bowie.
Yeah. I would love
Get
this
it.
game to be remastered too, because I'm a fan of the Quantic Dream games. I've played like all of them from the PS3 era onwards, and this is one of them that I haven't played
I still
because,
think this is one of their best.
yeah, and the reason why is because it's not as accessible. Like, I don't have an easy method to get it on the PC currently, and I don't think it works on newer hardware as well if I did have the discs. And it's a Dreamcast game, which I have a Dreamcast. There's one behind me, but like, um, uh, yeah, like, I have the Dreamcast. I know you have the game, but it's just like, I don't plug in my Dreamcast all the time.
No.
And it's like neither do other people, and it's like, okay, so it's kind of like a game that's sort of on the side, and it's I'll get to it when I get to it. Is kind of the famous saying that people have sort of heard me
And
say. It's
and
like, well, is that
like
10 years
much
from now?
very different from a lot of the games that they moved on to.
Hmm.
This actually had some combat sections in it.
Oh, okay.
So,
Yeah, because the combat in like Beyond Two Souls was there, but it was like Walking Dead combat. It was
it's
very
all QTE.
QTEs, yeah, which
Yeah.
is fine, but like, yeah, it'd
It's
be
a bit of
interesting if they updated
it's
it with the new Detroit engine, and made it look really great and refreshed it a little bit. I would certainly be more interested in playing it.
I would be fully on board. I thought it was I think it's a wonderful story and a wonderfully told story
Hmm.
and a good kind of a good look at where they came from because we can see where they've gone to at this point. So,
Yeah.
I think it's kind of an important piece of gaming history,
Especially since
and
it's
I
such a from a company that is so well known and well revered. Like,
yeah.
not everybody has access to it anymore, and because you're one of those companies, this is I think this is a very good choice.
I mean I even Indigo Prophecy is still fairly accessible.
Hmm.
So yeah, Omicron the Nomad Soul. So
Cool,
that's
cool.
my suggestion if anyone's listening who can make that happen. But what do you guys think? What's something that you guys would like to see remade or remastered? Just
Yeah.
let us know in the comments down below.
Hmm. And thanks for joining. If you're new here, be sure to like and subscribe, especially if you like the content, share it with somebody else who you think would also enjoy this discussion. We're releasing 2 episodes a week, and we will see you in the next video. All right, then.